What if I told you that quantum physics has proven that you are not inside the universe? The universe is inside you. Before reacting, before accepting or rejecting it, just feel the logical impact of this statement. Because if it is true, absolutely everything you believe about reality is inverted. Since childhood, you were taught that the universe is something immense, external, and objective, composed of galaxies, stars, space-time, and subatomic particles, and that, at some late point within this vastness, life emerged. Then the brain, then the mind, and finally, you. Small, localized, a secondary byproduct of matter. This is the narrative of modern materialism. Matter first, consciousness later. But 3,000 years ago, in ancient India, long before microscopes, telescopes, or particle accelerators, the sages who composed the Vedas and the Upanishads asserted something radically opposite. Consciousness is primary. Matter is secondary. The universe does not create consciousness. Consciousness creates the appearance of the universe. They called this fundamental reality Brahman, not as an anthropomorphic god, but as the infinite and indivisible field of consciousness from which everything emerges, in which everything vibrates, and to which everything returns. And what do we call separation? Maya. Maya does not mean that the world is false. It means that the way we perceive it is incomplete, that multiplicity is the appearance of the one when observed under certain conditions. Now fast forward to the 20th century. When physicists began investigating matter at subatomic scales, they expected to find ever smaller solid particles sustaining reality, fundamental building blocks of existence, stable little units that would explain everything. But what they found was deeply unsettling. There was no solidity, no fundamental thing. There was wave function, probability, potential. An electron does not exist in a definite place until it is measured. Before measurement, it exists as a superposition, all possibilities simultaneously. And only when an observational interaction occurs does the system collapse into a specific state. Observation alters the outcome. This is not philosophy. It is experimental result. The double-slit experiment showed that when you do not observe which path a particle takes, it behaves like a wave, creating an interference pattern. But when you do observe it, it behaves like a localized particle. The presence of measurement changes behavior. The observer participates in the observed reality, and suddenly, the ancient phrase echoes, the observer and the observed are one. We are not saying that your individual mind creates galaxies at will, but that fundamental reality is not composed of independent solid objects, but of interconnected fields in which separation depends on the mode of interaction. Before observation, there is diffuse unity. After observation, there is defined form. The Vedas said that the many emerge from the one. Physics describes the collapse of the wave function. Different languages, similar intuition. But the implication goes further. If particles are not isolated entities, and if observation influences the state that emerges, then the idea of a universe completely independent of consciousness begins to wobble. For 300 years, science operated under the assumption that the universe exists objectively in the same way regardless of any observer. But at the quantum scale, that independence becomes questionable. John Wheeler proposed the model of a participatory universe, suggesting that reality is not fully determined until it is observed, that observation is not merely passive recording, but an integral part of the process. The Upanishads asserted that the universe is Brahman observing itself in infinite forms, not as poetic metaphor, but as a description of the nature of existence. If consciousness is the fundamental field and form is a modulation of that field, then what you call the external world may be the visible expression of an invisible, indivisible field. And here the real tension begins, because if this is true, then the basic structure of reality may not be material, but experiential. Everything you have ever experienced of the universe, every star seen, every sound heard, every thought, occurred within conscious experience. You have never experienced anything outside consciousness. It has always been content appearing within the field of consciousness. This is not a religious argument. It is a phenomenological fact. Close your eyes for a moment and observe. Sounds appear. Sensations appear. Thoughts appear. Where? In consciousness. Can you point to an experience that exists outside consciousness? No. You can theorize about an independent external universe, but direct experience always happens within the conscious field. And so we return to the initial statement. If everything you know of the universe appears in consciousness, then at least at the level of experience, the universe is inside consciousness. And if consciousness is not a late byproduct of matter, but the primary field from which matter emerges as organized appearance, then the inversion is complete. You are not a small conscious being lost inside a vast and indifferent universe. The experienced universe is a phenomenon arising within the field of consciousness, and we have not yet reached the final point. Because when we examine quantum entanglement and the illusion of separation, the implication of this inversion will cease to be merely intriguing and will become inevitable. And you will begin to realize that perhaps you were never inside an external universe at all, but have always been the very consciousness in which the universe appears and recognizes itself. Now take one step further and face the most uncomfortable implication of all, because what truly began to shake materialism was not only the collapse of the wave function, but the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. When two particles interact, even if only for a fraction of a second, they can become entangled, which means they are then described by a single shared wave function. After that, you can separate them by kilometers, by planets, by entire galaxies, and still the state of one will be instantaneously correlated with the state of the other. If you measure one and find a particular spin, the other will automatically assume the complementary spin, without any signal traveling between them within the limit of the speed of light. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance because it seemed to violate the very structure of space-time. He believed there must be hidden variables explaining this correlation, some invisible mechanism preserving classical separation. But in 1964, John Bell demonstrated mathematically that no theory based on local hidden variables could reproduce the predictions of quantum mechanics. Decades later, experiments confirmed that Bell was right. Nature is not local in the classical sense. What appears separated in space may, at the fundamental level, be a single, indivisible system. Think carefully about this. If two particles can remain unified regardless of distance, then spatial separation is not an absolute feature of reality, but an emergent property of how we measure and describe systems. Distance may be an appearance, not a final ontological division. Now return to the ancient texts. When the Upanishads state, Tattvam Asi, you are that, they are saying that the essence of the individual is not separate from the essence of the whole. When they declare that one who sees all beings in the self and the self in all beings transcends fear, they are pointing to a unity that is not metaphorical, but structural. If at the deepest level there are not two independent systems, but a single field manifesting in multiple forms, then the separation we perceive is functional, not fundamental. Quantum physics does not use the word Brahman, but it speaks of universal quantum fields. According to quantum field theory, what we call particles are localized excitations of fields that extend throughout all space. An electron is not a solid little ball traveling through emptiness. It is a vibration in the electron field that permeates the entire universe. Likewise, photons are excitations of the electromagnetic field. What we call matter is vibrational pattern. There are no isolated objects floating in an absolute empty space. There is a continuum of dynamic fields interacting. Now observe the parallel. The Vedas describe reality as a primordial vibration, symbolized by Om, from which all forms emerge and to which they return. Physics describes reality as fields vibrating at different frequencies. In both cases, form is a modulation of a unified substrate. If this is true, then what you call you is also a vibrational pattern emerging within this field. Your body is a dynamic organization of atoms, which in turn are excitations of quantum fields. Your thoughts are electrochemical patterns in the brain, which are also configurations of fields. Everything is process, not fixed substance. And here, the deepest dissolution begins. If you are a process within a unified field, and if the field is not fragmented into absolutely independent entities, then the boundary between self and other may be more permeable than it appears. Entanglement is not just a rare laboratory phenomenon. It reveals something structural about reality. Systems that interact cease to be completely separable. In a sense, everything that has ever interacted in the universe remains connected within the global quantum description. This means the universe can be understood as a single immense wave function, evolving in a correlated way. Some physicists explicitly speak of a wave function of the universe. Now connect this to the previous point. If there exists a global wave function describing the entire cosmos, then the division into separate objects is a convenient way of describing reality at certain scales, but not its final portrait. Separation is useful for biological survival, but it may not be ontologically definitive. And then we return to consciousness. If fundamental reality is an indivisible field of potential that manifests as localized forms through interactions, and if the observer participates in the definition of those forms, then consciousness cannot be treated simply as an irrelevant byproduct. It is embedded in the very structure of the observed phenomenon. This does not mean that individual human consciousness creates the entire cosmos at will, but it suggests that the relationship between consciousness and reality is more intimate than classical materialism admitted. Ancient sages arrived at this conclusion through inner investigation. By directly examining experience, they realized that everything that appears, body, mind, world, arises within the field of consciousness. Physics arrived at a complementary conclusion through external investigation. At the fundamental level, there are no isolated solid blocks, but interconnected fields whose manifestation depends on interaction. When you bring these two lines of investigation together, something radical begins to emerge. Perhaps consciousness is not inside the universe as a late accident. Perhaps the experienced universe is inside consciousness as a modulation of a deeper field. But we have not yet closed the circle, because so far we have spoken of fields, vibrations, entanglement, and collapse. But we still need to confront the central question: what exactly is this you that could contain the universe? Is it your name, your history, your physical body? Or is it something prior to all of that? The simple fact of being conscious. In the next part, we will investigate this consciousness directly, not as theory, but as immediate experience. And when we do, the initial statement will stop sounding like a philosophical provocation and will begin to reveal itself as a precise description of what is happening right now. Now we arrive at the point where the investigation ceases to be merely conceptual and becomes inevitably experiential. Because everything we have discussed so far, quantum fields, entanglement, wave functions, Brahman, Maya, can remain nothing more than sophisticated ideas if you do not look directly at what is always present: consciousness itself. The central question is no longer whether particles are waves or whether the universe is a unified field. The question is, what is this consciousness that knows all of this? Because regardless of the theory you adopt, there is an undeniable fact in this very moment. You are conscious. Before any interpretation, before any scientific or spiritual explanation, there is the raw fact of experience. There is perception. There is presence. There is something that knows it is reading these words. Now observe something profoundly simple and at the same time revolutionary. Everything you know of the universe appears to you as experience. The idea of distant galaxies, the concept of subatomic particles, the memory of your past, the sensation of your body sitting here now, all of this arises in consciousness. You have never had direct access to a world out there independent of experience. You have always had access to perceptions, thoughts, sensations. This is not solipsism. It is a phenomenological observation. If you try to find something that exists outside consciousness, you will notice that even this attempt appears as a thought within consciousness itself. Now take this one step further. When you say I, what exactly are you referring to? The body. The body is perceived. Physical sensations appear in experience. The collection of thoughts and memories, they also appear. Emotions arise and fade. Mental states change. All of this is variable content, but there is something that does not vary. The fact that you are conscious of these contents. This conscious presence has no form, no color, no weight. You cannot locate it the way you locate an object, and yet it is the basis of all experience. The Vedic texts called this Atman, the essential self, not the psychological ego, but the pure consciousness in which the ego appears. And they made an even more radical claim. Atman is Brahman. Individual consciousness, in its essence, is not different from universal consciousness. Now, before accepting or rejecting this claim, investigate. When you observe your thoughts, who is the observer? Can you find a solid, separate entity observing the thoughts? Or is there simply consciousness and thoughts arising within it? If you close your eyes and pay attention, you will see that thoughts arise spontaneously. Sensations arise spontaneously. Sounds arise spontaneously. You do not deliberately create each thought before it appears. They simply emerge. Consciousness is there, open, allowing everything to appear. Is this consciousness inside your body, or does the body appear within consciousness? It may seem counterintuitive, but examine it honestly. The only thing you know directly is the experience of the body. Tactile, visual, proprioceptive sensations, and all of these experiences appear in consciousness. You have never experienced the body outside conscious experience. So from a direct point of view, the body is content within consciousness. Now connect this with quantum physics. If, at the fundamental level, there are no independent solid objects, but fields of potential that manifest as localized forms when observed, then the rigid distinction between subject and object begins to weaken. Observation is not external to the system, it is part of the system. The observer is not an isolated spectator looking at a completely objective cosmic machine. The observer is involved in the very manifestation of the phenomenon. John Wheeler suggested that the universe is participatory, that observable reality depends on acts of observation throughout cosmic history. This does not mean that individual human minds create the Big Bang, but it does imply that the structure of reality includes observation as a constitutive element. Now see the parallel. The Yoga Sutras state that the observer, the act of observing, and the observed object are, in essence, a single reality that appears divided due to ignorance. Quantum physics shows that the state of a system depends on observational interaction, and that systems which interact become inseparable. Both point toward the dissolution of absolute separation. And here, the final inversion we have been building from the beginning emerges. If everything you know of the universe appears in consciousness, and if consciousness cannot be found as an object within the universe, but is the condition for the universe to be known, then the idea that you are inside the universe begins to lose meaning, because the experienced universe is inside consciousness. This is not an empty mystical claim. It is a precise description of the structure of experience. The sky you see appears in consciousness. The distant sound appears in consciousness. The sensation of your heartbeat appears in consciousness. Even the idea of a cosmos billions of light years across arises as a thought in consciousness. Now imagine that this consciousness is not a local product of the brain, but the very ground of reality, as the Vedic traditions suggest. Imagine that the brain is a modulation within consciousness, not its source. Physics does not yet have a complete theory of consciousness, but it has already shown that matter, at its deepest level, is neither solid nor independent. This opens space to reconsider the primacy of consciousness. If consciousness is fundamental, then the universe is not a container within which you are confined. The universe is a set of appearances within the conscious field. And when you begin to perceive this directly, not as belief, but as experience, something changes radically. The sense of separation begins to weaken. Fear based on isolation begins to be questioned. Because if the observer and the observed are not absolutely separate, if the field is one and forms are temporary modulations, then the rigid identity of me versus the world loses its foundation. But we are not finished yet. In the next part, we will integrate this experiential investigation with the deeper cosmological implications of modern physics, and you will see that the initial question, whether the universe is inside you, is not merely a philosophical provocation, but may be the inevitable logical consequence of uniting science with radical introspection. Now we need to take the boldest step of all, because up to this point we have dismantled the solidity of matter, questioned absolute separation, and investigated consciousness as the field of experience. But there is still one last stronghold of materialism left: space-time. Even if particles are waves and observation influences quantum states, many still believe that at least space and time are the fixed stage on which everything happens, a neutral, solid, absolute backdrop. However, 20th century physics also shook this foundation. Relativity showed that space and time are not rigid, independent structures, but elastic dimensions that curve with energy and mass. Time is not the same for all observers. Simultaneity is not absolute. Space is not fixed. What once seemed like an immutable background revealed itself to be dynamic. And when relativity is combined with quantum mechanics in attempts to formulate a theory of quantum gravity, something even more radical begins to emerge. Space-time itself may not be fundamental. It may be emergent. Some modern approaches suggest that space can arise from patterns of quantum entanglement. In other words, fundamental connectivity is not spatial. Space may be a consequence of deeper relations. If this is true, then distance and location are not primary properties of reality, but secondary effects. Think about the implication. If space is emergent, then physical separation may not be an absolute given, but an appearance generated by deeper levels of organization. Now return to the ancient texts. When the sages said that Brahman is beyond time and space, eternal and infinite, they were not describing something located somewhere in the cosmos. They were pointing to a reality that is not contained within space-time, but from which space-time emerges. If the fundamental field is not inside the universe, but the universe arises within it, then the inversion gains full force, because what is fundamental cannot be contained within what is derived. If consciousness is fundamental and space-time is emergent, then consciousness is not inside space. Space appears within consciousness. This seems absurd only because we are accustomed to thinking from the outside in. We are used to imagining a brain inside a skull, producing thoughts inside a body, inside a planet, inside a galaxy. But this entire hierarchy is known only as conscious experience. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, and you feel ready to deepen this experience, I've left a more complete material in the pinned comment. You don't need to look at it now. Just remember it when the time feels right. You have never experienced space as something outside perception. The sensation of distance is perceived. The notion of past and future is thought now. Psychological time always happens in the present of consciousness. The past is memory arising now. The future is imagination arising now. The only point where everything happens is this immediate conscious field. The Mandukya Upanishad states that that which transcends past, present, and future is ultimate reality itself, not because time is denied, but because time is seen as a modulation within consciousness. Now connect this with modern physics. If space-time can emerge from deeper quantum relations, then the structure of reality is not a solid stage containing events, but a dynamic web of relations whose manifestation depends on interactions. And if observation participates in these interactions, then the role of consciousness ceases to be peripheral. It becomes structural. Here we reach a critical point, the experience of being located inside a universe, may be the result of the way consciousness identifies with a body and interprets sensory information. This identification generates the feeling of, I am here and the world is out there. But when you investigate directly, you do not find a clear dividing line between inside and outside. You find perception happening. Visual sensations appear. Sounds appear. Thoughts appear. Everything arises in the same indivisible field. The division into internal and external is a useful mental categorization, but perhaps not a fundamental one. Now imagine that consciousness is like an infinite screen, and the universe is the film projected onto it. The characters in the film may believe they are inside a vast world, but their entire world exists on the screen. This metaphor is not perfect, but it points to the inversion we are building. If consciousness is the field in which all forms appear, then you are not contained in the universe in the way you imagined. The experienced universe is a pattern emerging within the conscious field, and this leads us to the most destabilizing point so far. If space, time, matter, and separation are possibly emergent, then what you call solid objective reality out there may be an interface, a representation, a manifestation conditioned by modes of interaction. Physics does not explicitly claim that consciousness is the absolute foundation, but it has removed the naivete of the idea that the world is simply a collection of solid, independent objects existing in the same way for all observers. It has revealed a relational, probabilistic, and interdependent universe. And the Vedic texts, by another route, pointed to an indivisible reality in which observer and observed are expressions of a single consciousness. When you unite these two lines of investigation, something inevitable begins to take shape. The experience of being a separate individual inside an external cosmos may be a localized perspective of the totality itself, not an error, but a partial expression. The wave believing itself to be separate from the ocean. And here the initial question returns with more force than ever. What if you are not inside the universe, but the universe is arising within the field of what you truly are? We will not yet close this statement completely, because in the next part we will integrate all of this with the direct practice taught by the ancient sages, not as belief, but as verifiable experience. And then the loop that began at the very start will begin to close in a definitive and impossible to ignore way. Now we arrive at the point where everything must stop being merely fascinating and become transformative, because up to now you have followed a powerful intellectual journey. We dismantled the solidity of matter, showed that particles are vibrational patterns, that separation may not be fundamental, that space-time may be emergent, that observation participates in the observed phenomenon, and that consciousness is the only absolutely undeniable fact of experience. But if all of this remains only as interesting information, nothing truly changes. The question now is direct. If the experienced universe arises within consciousness, what does that mean for you here and now? Return to the beginning. What if I told you that quantum physics has proven that you are not inside the universe? The universe is inside you. At first, this sounded like provocation. Now it begins to look like a logical consequence. Because think with surgical precision. Everything you know of the universe appears as conscious experience. You have never touched an electron outside experience, never seen a galaxy outside perception, never lived a single second outside consciousness. Even the idea of a universe that existed before your birth appears as a thought now. The past is present memory. The future is present imagination. Space is present perception. Everything happens in the immediate field of consciousness. Now ask the decisive question. Does this consciousness have boundaries? Can you find the point where it ends and the world begins? Or is everything you call the world being perceived within it? If you look honestly, you will see that there is no clear experiential dividing line. There is perception happening. There is consciousness knowing contents. The sense of, I am here inside the body, is itself a perceived content. Bodily sensations appear in consciousness in the same way sounds and images appear. The body is not holding consciousness. The body is experience within consciousness. This is what the Vedic traditions were pointing to when they said that the body appears in consciousness, not the other way around. This is what is implied when they say that Atman is Brahman, that the essence of the individual is not different from the essence of the whole, not because the individual personality creates the cosmos, but because fundamental consciousness is not fragmented. The feeling of separation is a localized modulation of the totality itself. Now, connect this with what physics has revealed. If, at the fundamental level, there are no independent solid objects but interconnected vibrational fields, and if systems that interact become inseparable, and if space-time can emerge from deeper relations, then the image of a universe composed of isolated parts begins to collapse. What remains is a unified process expressing itself as multiplicity. The wave is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean in motion. The individual is not separate from the field. It is the field in a specific configuration. But here comes the most impactful part. If separation is, ultimately, a functional appearance and not an absolute ontological division, then fear based on isolation begins to lose its foundation. Much of human suffering arises from the sense of being isolated in an indifferent universe, of being a fragile entity competing for survival in an external environment. But if the observer and the observed are expressions of a single reality, then the narrative changes completely. You are not a biological accident lost in a cold cosmos. You are the very conscious field through which the cosmos knows itself. This is not blind belief. It is something that can be directly investigated. Right now, pause for a few seconds and simply observe. There is consciousness. Within it, sensations arise. Within it, thoughts arise. Within it, the sense of identity arises. This consciousness has no age, no form. It cannot be located in space like an object. It simply is, and everything appears within it. If you try to find consciousness as a thing, you will fail. But if you try to find anything outside it, you will also fail, because everything that can be known appears within it. And here, the loop closes with full force. You were never inside an objective universe separate from your experience. The universe you know has always been inside the field of consciousness. Quantum physics does not explicitly say consciousness is everything, but it has removed the ground from the naive view of a solid world independent of the observer. It has shown that reality is relational, participatory, vibrational. The ancient sages, by another route, said that reality is consciousness observing itself in multiple forms, two different paths, one point of convergence. So, when I said at the beginning that you are not inside the universe is inside you, I was not talking about your ego, your name, or your personal history. I was talking about the consciousness that you are before any label, the consciousness in which the body appears, the consciousness in which the world appears, the consciousness in which time appears. If this consciousness is fundamental and not derived, then the phenomenological universe is an expression within it. This changes everything. It changes how you see others, because the other is not absolutely other. It changes how you see death, because what you truly are is not a localized object that begins and ends in time. It changes how you see fear, because fear depends on the belief in absolute separation. When separation is seen as appearance, fear begins to dissolve in understanding. And now the final question is no longer, how did the ancients know? Nor does physics definitively prove this. The final question is, if you recognize, even for an instant, that consciousness is the field in which the universe appears, how do you live? Do you continue acting as an isolated fragment? Or do you begin to act as a conscious expression of the whole? Because once this inversion is seen clearly, it cannot be completely unseen. You are not an accidental observer in a mechanical universe. You are the point of view through which the universe experiences itself. The cosmos is not only out there, it is happening now as conscious experience. And if everything you have ever known of the universe appeared within this consciousness that you are, then perhaps the most radical statement of all is simply the most obvious one. There were never two. There has always been one field manifesting as a many, and that was implicit from the very beginning. Now begins the most uncomfortable part of the entire journey, because up to this point, we have dismantled external structures, solid matter, absolute separation, fixed space-time. But there is still something inside you that remains intact. Identity. Not social identity, not your name, not your profession. The silent identity you take for granted. I am this separate individual living inside an external world. This is the last fortress. And what if this fortress is just another emergent interpretation? Pause for a moment and observe something deeply unsettling. The feeling of being someone also appears in consciousness. The sense of being a localized center behind the eyes, of being inside the body looking outward, is an experience. It is not an absolute fact. It is a recurring perception. It arises as a sensory and cognitive pattern. There may be pressure behind the forehead, centralized visual images, inner language saying, I. All of this is content, and all content appears in consciousness. If the body appears in consciousness, if thoughts appear in consciousness, if even the sense of identity appears in consciousness, then who exactly is inside the universe? The psychological character? Yes. The biological body? Functionally, yes. But that which perceives the body and the character, where is that contained? Return to physics for a moment. At the quantum level, particles do not possess definite properties until interaction. A particle's identity is contextual. It does not carry fixed attributes independent of relationship. Now think about human identity. Much of what you call me is relational. Your name depends on language. Your personality depends on memory. Your history depends on narrative. Your sense of location depends on sensory perception. All of this is dynamic construction. What remains when you remove the narratives? When you silence inner language for a few seconds? What remains is not a solid entity, but pure consciousness, open, without specific form. This consciousness does not say, I am male or female, I am young or old, I am successful or a failure. These are stories within it. Consciousness itself is prior to any qualification. Now feel the impact of this. If fundamental consciousness does not possess a fixed individual identity, but is an open field in which identities arise, then the idea that you are a separate entity inside an external universe begins to look like a conceptual overlay. The existential crisis begins here. Because if you are not merely the body, nor merely the mind, nor merely the personal narrative, then what are you? And if what you are cannot be located in space in the same way an object can, then perhaps you are not inside space in the way you imagined. Modern physics suggests that space may emerge from patterns of information and entanglement. Some theories propose that the very geometry of the universe arises from fundamentally non-spatial relations. If space is emergent, then location is emergent. And if location is emergent, then the sensation of being here at a fixed point may be a functional property of the organism, not an ontological characteristic of consciousness. Observe directly. Where is consciousness? Can you point to it? Is it in the brain? That is a scientific hypothesis based on neural correlations, but direct experience does not reveal consciousness as a physical object. It reveals brain activity as images on scans, thoughts as mental phenomena, but consciousness itself does not appear as a thing. It is that which knows things. If consciousness is not an object within the observable universe, then perhaps the error lies in the initial assumption that it must be contained within it. Now feel the internal collapse this can cause. Throughout your life, you have operated with the implicit sense that you are a tiny fragment inside a gigantic cosmic structure. This view shapes fear, ambition, competition, survival anxiety. But if fundamental reality is a unified field of vibration and consciousness, then you are not an isolated fragment struggling for space. You are a temporary modulation of the totality. This does not eliminate functional individuality. The body continues to exist. The personality continues to operate. Responsibilities remain real. But the ontological foundation changes. The fear of absolute annihilation begins to be questioned, because what you truly are, consciousness, is not an object that can be broken like an atom or dissolved like a chemical compound. Objects change. Forms arise and disappear, but the field in which they appear remains. Physics says that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transformed. The Vedas say that fundamental being is eternal, not because form never changes, but because essence neither begins nor ends. Different languages, similar direction. Now the most disturbing question of all. If you are not merely a separate individual inside the universe, but the very consciousness through which the universe appears, what does that do to your notion of control? Because the ego wants to control an external world. But if there is no absolute separation, then the game changes. It is no longer me versus the world. It is the field experiencing itself through multiple perspectives. This dissolves arrogance and despair at the same time. You are not the personally omnipotent creator of the cosmos, but neither are you an insignificant victim of external forces. You are an expression of the same field we call reality. And here we enter the reconstruction that will come in the next parts. Because after the separate identity begins to dissolve, there are two possibilities: fear or freedom. Fear, if you cling to the old narrative. Freedom, if you recognize that you were never truly isolated. The initial sentence begins to resonate again. You are not inside the universe. The universe is inside you, not inside your ego, but inside the consciousness that is prior to the ego. And if this consciousness has no clear boundaries, if it is the field in which all forms arise, then the rigid distinction between inner and outer may be only a functional tool, not the final truth. In the next part, we will rebuild identity from this new perspective, not as abstract theory, but as practical implication for existence, action, and perception. Because if you truly are the field in which the universe appears, then the way you live must reflect that. And that is where everything truly begins to change. Now that the old identity has begun to crack, we need to rebuild something deeper in its place. Because once you question the idea of being an absolutely separate individual, a dangerous void can appear. If I am not just my body, nor just my mind, nor just my story, then what am I? That question can generate anxiety, or it can open the door to the greatest expansion possible. The reconstruction begins with an essential distinction. There is the character, and there is consciousness. The character continues to exist. It has a name, a past, preferences, traumas, talents. It pays bills, answers messages, feels hunger, makes plans. None of this needs to be denied. The mistake is not in existing as a functional individual. The mistake is in believing that this layer is the totality of what you are. Consciousness, on the other hand, has no biography. It has no age. It has no nationality. It has no gender. It cannot be measured in kilograms or located in centimeters. It is the open field in which the character appears, and here is the most powerful turn. You do not need to destroy the character to recognize consciousness. You only need to stop confusing the two. Imagine the ocean and a wave. The wave has a specific form, a specific duration, a specific height. It can even compare itself to other waves. It may seem bigger or smaller. It may feel threatened by winds, but in essence, it is water. The ocean is not separate from the wave. The wave does not need to disappear in order to be the ocean. It already is the ocean in motion. In the same way, the individual does not need to disappear for unity to be recognized. The individual is unity in a localized perspective, universal consciousness expressing itself as a specific point of view. This completely changes the way you live, because when you believe you are only the character, you live in defense mode. You need to protect your image. You need to win comparisons. You need to constantly secure safety. But when you recognize that the character is an expression of the larger field, a different kind of stability emerges. You still act, you still work, you still build, but the foundation is no longer ontological lack. It is expression. Now connect this with everything we have seen about physics. If fundamental reality is a unified field vibrating in different patterns, then each being is a specific pattern within that field. Different in form, identical in essence. Just as particles are excitations of quantum fields, individuals can be seen as excitations of fundamental consciousness. The form varies. The substrate is the same. This has profound practical implications. First, regarding fear. If separation is not absolute, then fear based on isolation begins to lose its foundation. Biological fear remains functional. You still pull your hand away from fire, but the existential fear of being alone in an indifferent universe begins to dissolve, because there is no absolute outside threatening an isolated inside. There is an interdependent field continuously reorganizing itself. Second, regarding relationships. If the other is not absolutely separate from you in essence, then empathy ceases to be an abstract moral virtue and becomes clear perception. When you look at someone, you are seeing another modulation of the same conscious field. This is not spiritual poetry. It is the logical consequence of fundamental unity. Compassion arises naturally when rigid separation weakens. Third, regarding purpose. If you are the universe experiencing itself from a specific point, then your existence is not accidental in a hollow sense. It is the inevitable expression of the totality. Just as each wave is an expression of the ocean, each conscious perspective is a form through which reality knows itself. Now return to direct experience. At this exact moment, there is consciousness reading these words. There are thoughts reacting. There may be resistance. There may be expansion. All of this is happening within the same field. This field is not personal in a limited sense, but it is expressing itself personally through you. And here, the definitive integration begins. You can continue living as a functional individual, but now with a different understanding of the foundation. You are not a fragment trying to survive inside a strange universe. You are the cosmic process itself taking temporary form as you. This does not remove challenges. It does not eliminate pain. It does not turn life into a perfect mystical tale. But it changes the relationship with everything. Because if you are an expression of the field, then every experience, pleasure, or difficulty is the field exploring possibilities through your perspective. And this brings us to the final closure that is still to come. Because one thing remains: to answer the initial question completely, in a way that is irrefutable and emotionally inevitable. We have already dismantled the old view. We have crossed the crisis. We have rebuilt identity through the lens of unity. In the next part, we will close the loop in an absolute way, not merely as a logical argument, but as a direct recognition that is impossible to ignore. And when that happens, the sentence that began this entire journey will stop being a provocation and will become an exact description of what has been happening all along. And now the loop needs to close in an absolute way. At the beginning I said, what if you are not inside the universe, but the universe is inside you? When that sentence first appeared, it probably sounded like provocation, philosophical exaggeration, or mysticism disguised as science. But now you have walked the entire path necessary for that statement to stop being rhetorical, impact, and become logical consequence. Modern physics has shown that matter is not solid at the fundamental level. Particles are excitations of fields. Objects are temporary vibrational patterns. Absolute separation is not a basic feature of reality. Entanglement revealed that systems can remain inseparable regardless of distance. Space-time may not be the fixed backdrop we once imagined, but something emergent from deeper relationships. The observer is not external to the phenomenon. It participates in defining what appears. In parallel, direct investigation of experience has revealed something equally unavoidable. Everything you know about the universe appears in consciousness. The body appears. Thoughts appear. Emotions appear. The world appears. The past arises as memory now. The future arises as imagination now. Space is perceived now. You have never had access to anything outside conscious experience. Even when you imagine a universe existing billions of years before your birth, that imagination happens where? In consciousness. When you claim that the brain creates the mind, where does that theory appear? In consciousness. When you argue that matter is primary, where does that argument arise? In consciousness. No matter which model you adopt, it always appears within the conscious field. This does not deny science. It simply recognizes the structural limit of experience. Every description of the universe is a phenomenon within consciousness, never outside it. Now, the decisive question is simple and devastating. Can you find, in direct experience, a universe that exists outside consciousness? Not as a concept, but as a real experience. What you find are perceptions, sounds, sensations, thoughts, all arising within the same field. The division between me in here and world out there is a functional organization of perception, useful for biological navigation, but it does not appear as an absolute boundary in direct experience. What appears is simply experience happening. When I said that the universe is inside you, I was not talking about your ego, your personality, or your personal history. I was talking about the consciousness that is present before any story. This consciousness has no detectable edges, no color, no age, cannot be located like an object, and yet everything you know appears within it. If space can be emergent, if separation can be relational, if matter is vibration in a field, if the observer participates in the observed reality, then the idea that you are an isolated object inside an external universe begins to lose coherence. What starts to make far more sense is something much more radical. The experienced universe is a modulation within the field of consciousness, and that consciousness is what you are prior to any definition. Not as belief, not as abstract philosophy, but as the immediate fact of experience. Now feel the existential impact of this. If you are not an isolated fragment struggling inside an indifferent cosmic machine, if you are the very field through which the cosmos knows itself, then fear changes its nature, relationship changes its nature, purpose changes its nature. You are not separate from reality trying to survive it. You are reality happening. The ocean is not inside the wave. The wave is inside the ocean, but the water is the same. In the same way, the universe is not inside the personal you. The personal you is inside consciousness, and the universe is too. There were never two separate containers. There was always one field manifesting as multiple points of view. And now return to the initial question, the same one that opened everything. What if you are not inside the universe, but the universe is inside you? After everything we have gone through, physics, direct investigation, dissolution of separation, reconstruction of identity, that question no longer sounds absurd. It sounds inevitable, because in this exact moment, everything you call the universe is appearing where it has always appeared, here, in consciousness, and you were never inside it. It was always arising within you, if this message truly resonated with you. If you felt that quiet inner shift, that sense that your mind is ready for something greater, I left a resource in the pinned comment that goes deeper into this process. I only recommend it for those who feel genuinely ready to accelerate their results, but follow it in your own time. If it calls to you, you'll find it there. What you just heard only reaches its full meaning if you understand the foundation that came before it. This video closes the loop by showing that matter is not solid, that separation is not fundamental, that time and space arise within consciousness, and that everything you call the universe appears inside the same conscious field. But the previous video builds the necessary ground for this inversion to make sense. It explains how observation collapses reality, how identity stabilizes patterns, how fear becomes coherence, and why the observer you sustain determines which version of reality becomes concrete. Without that understanding, this sounds philosophical. With it, this becomes an unavoidable logical consequence. If you want to see how the observer is formed before the universe is inverted, The previous video is on your screen now.